Also ahead, we'll travel across the ditch with Kiwis heading to the polls tomorrow. But first, this Friday, we are 26 hours away from the first votes being counted in the referendum on an Indigenous voice to Parliament. And the Prime Minister's using the final full day of campaigning to tour the crucial states of South Australia and Tasmania as he tries to convince Australians to vote yes when they turn up to the ballot box. The No campaign, supported by senior members that is, of the federal opposition, is continuing its pitch to voters that the voice proposal lacks detail and will divide the country by race. A record number of Australians are enrolled to vote in this referendum, among them the highest number of Indigenous voters for any democratic endeavour in the nation's history. And despite polling suggesting a win by the No campaign, the message is that the race is far from won.
We know that there are many Australians out there that are just turning their mind to this issue right now, just starting to consider. More than about 2/3 of the population are yet to cast their vote in this referendum, and our Yes campaign will be out there every minute between now and then, having the conversations as we have over many years.
We need a voice. I'm really concerned about the No people spreading lies. I have got grannies, I've got great-grandchildren. Will they have a voice when they grow up and they have their children? This is a big concerning.
Yes! Yes! Yes!
Hey mate, how you going? This bloke,
Very good.
it's like he flew down.
Oh, mate, what's going on, mate?
It's always fantastic. We will feel better about ourselves on Sunday with a yes vote, just as we felt better after the apology to the stolen generation.
Nice and quiet. It's divisive, it's permanent once it goes into the Constitution, and I just don't think in their millions of Australians are going to support it. In fact, quite the opposite.
We've got to have people turn up today, we've got to have people vote, and then hopefully we'll have a decision by tonight. If not tonight, tomorrow night. I don't even know where I am. Where am I? All these people here from the No side have been decent. They're not calling people racist. You know, I've been called dreadful names in some of the polling booths, the pre-polling and that across the country. You know, we're not calling anyone names.
This is a time where Australians have that opportunity to show the generosity of spirit that I see in the Australian character, where at the worst of times we always see the best of the Australian character. I hope we see that tomorrow. I hope we see that generosity. And I call upon my fellow Australians to vote yes tomorrow.
And the ABC will give you a front row seat to the results as they come in, along with the best analysis of what it means for the country with our referendum team. Among our experts, the doyen of Australian psephology, armed with his marvellous touchscreen, the ABC's chief election analyst, Anthony Green, who joins us live from our referendum centre in Sydney. Anthony, let's start with the bare bones here. What are we looking for as the results start to trickle in tomorrow night?
Well, it's a bit different from a normal Australian election. We don't have all that comparative swing and prediction of that we normally use to call an election. At this election, we don't have any history to compare it with. You can compare it to the Labor vote at the last election, the yes vote, but it's not a very good guide. What we will be doing is watching the raw numbers and the percentages, and we know that because there's only two candidates on the ballot paper, essentially, and it's the same in every polling place across the country, is the results are going to come in from each polling place, basically based on how many votes they have to count. We'll get lots of small rural booths first. All opinion poll indicates that the yes case is a very poor position in the country, so they'll vote solidly no. The yes vote will start low on that basis and then rise, and what we'll be watching for on the night is when does it stop rising, and I'd expect by about 10% of the vote counted in each state, the trend will solidify at that point.
We've heard so much over the last couple of weeks or so, particularly since pre-poll opened, about the large number of Australians who are showing up to vote early, or they're applying for postal votes. What impact does that have on what you're going to be doing tomorrow night in trying to make sense of how Australians have voted?
Well, I went back and looked at the 99 referendum, and 80% of the votes were cast on the day. These days, it will be under 50%. There's 6 times as many pre-polls as in 99, 4 times as many postals. What's interesting, though, is that that means that all those pre-polls will come in on election night in 1999, referendum night. 68% of the vote was counted in New South Wales by 7:30, which is basically enough to call the election. It won't get to 68 this time because there's going to be less than 50% people voting on the day, but I suspect we'll get all the polling places within 2 hours in each state, so by 8 p.m. in the eastern states. And then there'll be a bit of a lull before the bigger pre-poll centres come in, because you're counting 20,000 votes takes longer than 2,000 votes. So we'll get a huge surge, a bit of a pause and a rise. I think if all those pre-polls, all those postals, sorry, let me get these words right, if all the polling day votes come in that first hour, we should get a pretty good picture within an hour of the close of polling.
And we hear so much about, certain states could be the crucial ones in this debate. What states are you going to be looking out for? What sort of areas across the country are really going to give you a sense of how Australians have cast their ballots?
Well, given how quickly the votes will come in, the thing we'll be watching initially is New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania, South Australia half an hour later. That's even before we get to Queensland, starting at 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. They should give us a good picture of what's going on. We will get those early figures from the country. They will be heavily weighted against yes. That figure will rise, as I said. Basically, what we'll be watching for is the trend in the cities. No state will vote yes unless the capital city votes yes. So we'll be waiting to get a good sample of votes from cities like Sydney and Melbourne, and then looking at where they're from in those 2 cities. If you go by anything in the referendum and anything in the polling we've been hearing, is the yes vote will be higher in the inner city and the no vote will be higher in the outer suburbs. That's the trend we'll be looking for. If that does show through very early in the figures, then and if the polls are as clear-cut, if the result is as clear-cut as some of the polls, then we should have a very early call in most states. I would say 1 hour after the close of counting in each state. Unless it's close, we should be able to call each state.
Well, Anthony, thank you. Anthony will, of course, be at the touchscreen throughout the evening for us here at the ABC in our referendum centre. And that's where we also find our voice correspondent, Dan Borsche. You're missing a megaphone, you two, to talk to each other across that vast studio at the ABC in Sydney. Dan, what have we learned? You've been covering this campaign since the very beginning. What have we learned from the campaigns over the last couple of months?
Well, you talk about a megaphone there, and the thing that I've learned is about listening. I've had the opportunity to travel right around this country, sit down and hear so many conversations from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, from Australians of all walks of life, considering this question that we're going to be all voting on tomorrow, of course, those who haven't yet made their decision, and really seeking to understand the lived experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the many varied views from the Indigenous community, and then talking about what this means and what this is seen, what lens this is seen through for other Australians. And it has been a fascinating and extraordinary ride. It's also been one, Matthew, that has been at times incredibly tough when people are opening up and sharing very heartfelt stories. There was Victor Beale, who I met in Walgett, who told me about the experience of his father, who was a member of the Stolen Generation, taken as a child while he was going to get food for his family. And all these years later, how that still has an impact on Victor and his children. And as a result, they don't trust police, the blue uniforms they called them. Victor told me that he was going to be voting yes because he thought that while this didn't go as far as he had hoped, that he saw this as a step in the right direction. Not far from there in Brewarrina, Grace Gordon, a community leader who has been an incredible advocate against domestic violence, told me that she has an avenue, a model in her own community, and while she thinks that the voice could achieve something, she's worried that it simply wouldn't have the right mechanisms to get the right people there, and therefore she was leaning more towards a no. These are stories, Matthew, and experiences that are seeped in people's lived experience, and it's been so important for all of us to listen to them.
And Dan, this is tomorrow, polling day. It is the culmination of months of formal campaigning, but years, decades of advocacy by the Indigenous community in this space. I know we are getting ahead of ourselves, seeing as polling hasn't even closed. We haven't started counting the votes as yet, but what are the next steps from here? What has to happen, regardless of if it's a yes or a no vote, when the country wakes up on Sunday morning?
Well, you're absolutely right that there have been calls that have been made for change for decades, going right back to when the boats arrived, right through until the 1930s, the day of mourning, the petitions, the calls for treaty, those calls to Parliament to listen to the experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that went right through and up to the High Court in the case of Mabo. And then there have been processes over the last 30 years that have led to the point that we are discussing right now, of course, the vote tomorrow, where all Australians will make their decision. And we are going to be all watching very closely to see where Australians vote and whether it's a yes or a no and how that pans out. And of course, that will prompt a whole range of other questions. If it's a yes vote that's delivered by the Australians, it will be up to those yes campaigners in the government to say, well, this is what the next steps are. There will be this bipartisan committee that would look at designing the framework for a voice and how would they seek to get input from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the communities that are most affected by government policies that would be seeking to have that voice. If it's a no vote, then what does that mean? What is the alternative? We know that the Prime Minister says that there wouldn't be a legislative voice. That was a comment made this week because the mandate from Australians, if it's a no, would be crystal clear. No campaigners have said there has got to be a plan B. And so the question will be, what is that? And what is the detail from those no campaigners in the opposition who have campaigned so heavily against this? And in addition to that, we've heard politicians, campaigners from all stripes saying that the status quo is not working. They agree on that. They don't agree on the next steps, on the model forward, and that will be the question. In addition to both of those, Matthew, of course, there is a bigger question that all Australians are going to need to grapple with, and that is how to reconcile what has emerged through this year. At times, an incredibly damaging discussion where there has been racism and vitriol from the very fringes, a very loud minority on the fringes of this debate. But there is going to need to be a lot of soul-searching and healing because some of those wounds run incredibly deep.
Dan Borscher, not only the focus on tomorrow night, but clearly in the weeks, months and years ahead. We'll all be watching you and the team very closely tomorrow night. Thanks for joining us on Afternoon Briefing.
Thank you.
Well, ahead of the referendum, we were given a behind-the-scenes look at the heart of the Australian Electoral Commission's operations for this historic vote. Kath, we're here in the command centre for the Electoral Commission ahead of Saturday's referendum. What sort of things are you monitoring in here ahead of polling day?
So Matt, we are monitoring how many people have voted so far. So on the screens behind me you can see we're tracking pre-poll voting numbers. We expect about 50% of Australians will have voted early either through a pre-poll voting centre or through postal voting by the time Saturday rolls around. When it comes to Saturday though, we'll be looking at how our polling places are tracking and how the results are going after 6 p.m.
And when we're talking about those sort of trends when it comes to pre-poll, it does seem to be a growing trend of people who are casting their ballots early.
Yes, it has been a growing trend over several electoral events. So with each passing election, the number of people who pre-poll vote increases. Now, you do have to be eligible to be able to cast a pre-poll vote, and that means essentially that you're unavailable to vote on voting day, on the Saturday. But yes, it is absolutely an increasing trend that people seem to take advantage of the opportunity to vote early.
Does that put more pressure on the AEC to sort of ramp up earlier ahead of polling day?
In some ways, we've had pre-poll voting for many elections now, so it's something that we're well versed in. We do a good job of organising and running pre-poll voting. The challenge is counting those votes on the night. So in our polling places all around the country, 7,000 odd polling places that are in place on voting day, we have lots of staff in place in those places to count the votes on the night. That isn't the case for the pre-poll votes, which finish on Friday night. So we bring those into central locations and then we have to bring in a whole heap of extra staff to count those on the night. So we've got lots of people out and about in Australia counting votes in polling places, but also lots in our counting centres counting those pre-poll votes.
Some of the other issues or some of the other data rather that's being highlighted on these screens. We've got a map of the country over there with some icons. That's polling places, but the yellow marks, what are they?
So at the moment you can see our pre-poll voting centres, so the purple triangles are about 500 pre-poll voting centres around Australia, open now. The yellow triangles are fire risk around the country. As we know, over the last couple of weeks there has been increased fire risk that we've dealt with, and we did have to make some changes to schedules with our remote voter services. Mercifully at the moment the fire risk isn't as bad as we saw last week, and we hope that that continues through to the weekend, so it's a safe voting experience for Australians.
And does that mean that you have to have, say, if a community gets surrounded by fire and that location where you're going to be taking votes, could be a school, gym or something like that, gets commandeered for evacuation, you have to find a different location?
Absolutely. So we always need to be prepared for the worst, and we need to be flexible if a situation like that arose. We've been doing some exercises and planning for that to eventuate. If that did come about, we'd certainly notify the local community of what changes were in place for their particular polling place. That will be on the AEC website, but we'll also do media releases and local radio if that did eventuate.
And we've also got, in the age of social media, a ticking over feed of some of the commentary around the referendum there as well, keeping note of what people are talking about and how they're characterising the vote. Yeah,
look, social media is alive with information and commentary on the referendum, as you would expect. The things I'm most interested in from an operational perspective are how people are finding the voting experience. We're getting some great feedback on how voters are interacting in our polling places and finding it, by and large, a smooth experience. There's some negative commentary in there as well. Some we take on board and some we will necessarily take with a grain of salt. But yes, lots of activity on social media at the moment. How proactive do you have to be looking at some of that material ahead of polling day to make sure that people aren't getting the wrong message, or, you know, conspiracy theories and things aren't being perpetuated? Yeah, absolutely. We've seen, unfortunately, that mis and disinformation about the referendum process is a feature on social media. We've been really proactive in combating that. We have a disinformation register where we place prominent disinformation so that we can correct the record for Australians. It is a very small portion of what we see on social media. By and large, what we see is most Australians interacting in a respectful and civilised manner, getting in and out of the polling place as quickly as possible and casting their vote, having their say, maybe getting a democracy sausage on the way out. I did miss out on democracy sausage when I went to go and vote at Old Parliament House yesterday. I was quite disappointed. I got a badge though instead. Yes, well, that's often one of the disadvantages in casting your vote early. You might miss out on the democracy sausage. Much more likely to get that if you vote on polling. Exactly. That's one of the key messages to get out and vote. Look, I want to pick your brain as to what we're actually going to see on election night. Oh, not election night, referendum night. See, I'm pre-programmed to think of it as an election, not a referendum, hence how infrequent these events are. How quickly can you start getting across those results and feeding that information through to the public? Yes, so Matt, in theory, the count should be quicker on the night. So in a polling place, rather than counting all of the numbers that would be on a ballot paper in an election, we'll be counting 2 piles and a pile of informals. That should result in quicker results coming through from all of our polling places, that 7,000 I mentioned from across the country. Those results will be progressively posted to the AEC's virtual tally room at aec.gov.au. Then comes the margin, I suppose. So if the margin is wide, then it may be clear that there's a clear result on the night. Now, it won't be the AEC that calls the result. That is for psephologists, and no doubt media organisations such as your own will be carrying that sort of information. But for the AEC, we can't call the event until it is mathematically certain. And what that means is the number of outstanding votes, which is often postal votes, can't change the result. Now, there is 13 days for postal votes to come back to the AEC, and that means if the result is close and there's a large number of postal votes outstanding, we may well have to wait the 13 days to have a definitive, mathematically certain result.
And we've heard a lot about the remote polling places and operations that you guys are running this time around, more locations than ever before. How does it work in terms of getting those votes back to base to count them?
Yes. So, huge logistical exercise, as you can imagine. If you'd been here a week ago, you would have seen pictures of our GPS-tracked vehicles travelling around remote areas. It is a huge operation to get those safely and securely back to base to be counted. But those are already making their way back to our counting centres. We've got about 56 of those across the country. Those votes are taken back secured in secure transport to those locations, where after 6 p.m. on voting night, they will be opened by AEC teams, counted, and those results displayed on the tally room.
We'll all be waiting with considerable interest to see what those results are, and I'm sure this room will be a hive of activity. Everyone on their very best behaviour at the moment the cameras roll in here. Thank you so much for making the time for us today.
Pleasure. Thanks, Matt.
As we've heard, campaigners on both sides of the debate have been making their final pitch to undecided voters today. Prominent Yes campaigner Noel Pearson is appealing to Australians to look to the future.
This is it. In 24 hours, we're going to have the chance to vote for a new future for Australia. Let's not slam the door on the children. I'm the past, the children are the future. I've been working so hard, along with my Yes 23 campaigners, to set up the future for the children. I ask all Australians to have in focus over the next 24 hours the opportunity we have to set a new future for the Aboriginal children. This is what is at stake.
Well, let's bring in our political panel this Friday. From Melbourne, Labor Senator Jana Stewart joins us, and from Adelaide, the Shadow Child Protection Minister and Liberal Senator Karen Little. Welcome to both of you. Thanks for joining us. We just heard there from Noel Pearson talking about the future. Both sides of this debate have very differing views as to what that future looks like, or indeed what path should be taken to get to that future. Jana Stewart, I want to start with you. What's the final pitch to voters at the moment about what Australia looks like on the 15th?
Well, it really starts with the reminder that this is an idea that has come from First Nations people directly to each and every Australian to walk with us towards a better and more united future for our nation. Now, over 80% of First Nations people support enshrining a voice into our Constitution, and that's for a couple of reasons. It's about recognising the oldest continuous culture in the world in our Constitution, a piece of work that should have happened a long time ago but will take the 14th of October. And the other, obviously, important part of it is it's about listening to get better results. We know and have heard very clearly from Aboriginal communities across the country that where our communities are right now is simply not good enough. And their solution to the challenges that we face is to enshrine a voice into our Constitution, to have a guarantee of being heard. Because we know that when our families and our communities have a seat at the table, our children are healthier and our families are happier. And that is what we can wake up to on the 15th of October.
Karen Little, it sounds like what Jana Stewart is saying there about the goal is something that is shared across the spectrum here. Everyone wants to get to that stage, but as I said earlier, it's a case of a different path there. What's the road to the future looking like for you and for your fellow No campaigners?
Well, I want to address the claim that something like over 80% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples actually agree with this proposition, because I've seen the billboards. That's not reflective of what people are telling me. And in fact, only this week, a Resolve poll actually suggested that number was actually around 41% and didn't actually include people from remote communities. That 80% number comes from way back in January. I also want to talk about, I guess, the outcome from whatever the result is on Saturday, and that is we are all committed to improving the lives of Indigenous Australians. My position, based on before I came into Parliament and going into many organisations and fixing some of the projects that were broken, fixing some of the maladministration, is that this is not the answer. This is a bad proposal, and to suggest that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people aren't consulted already is quite frankly nonsense. There are Close the Gap groups, there are working groups, there are ambassadors, there are advocates, there are a whole range of people that already provide advice to the government, but also to parliamentarians. That should be happening already. We've had not just an Indigenous Affairs Minister in the last Parliament, but we've got one in this Parliament. I think they're important things to think about. The problem I have with this proposition is it's about putting in place a proposition that where we don't have the detail. This is about our foundation document, our most important rule book for this country, and it's being sold as this is the way that we will improve the lives of Indigenous Australians. But even Indigenous Australians are saying, where's the detail? Where's our comfort that this is going to lead to better outcomes for us? And simply, we're going to an election with most Australians voting on this proposition without that level of detail. We don't even know whether the people who are going to be representative of the voice are elected or they're going to be nominated. These are really important things to consider, because if the issue is health and the issue is around, say, dealing with cardiac disease, then I want to know that I'm speaking to the people who have expertise in dealing with cardiac issues. That's what I want to see. I want to see better outcomes in that area, but I don't think you're going to get it from voice. I think what we need to do is focus on those areas of greatest importance to the people that actually receive those services from these organisations that already get significant amounts of money. And in fact, just in the last parliamentary sitting, we had another proposition to explore and examine what's been happening in those organisations, identify organisations that are doing well, and it was knocked back by the Labor Party. It was knocked back by the Greens and by Senator Pocock. That's where you can make a difference right now, well before Saturday.
I think this discussion this afternoon is clear that there is not a homogenous view among the Indigenous population, so that we can use that as an example of that. Jana Stewart, picking up on some of the comments there from Senator Little, I think the argument has clearly been made that you don't put all of the detail in the Constitution, and that is something that is not there for many other elements of how Australia's society works. But given the fact that we are being asked as a country to vote on a principle like this, is it enough to kick that down the road and say that is a discussion for Parliament in future? Does Senator Little have a point there that more detail could be provided to the public to give them a flavour of what they're actually going to see in future?
Well, I think there's lots of information out there about what's possible when it comes to the voice. And in fact, there was a whole bunch of principles released back in March that go to some of these things, like how people might be selected, the expectation of them representing their communities. It talks about it being transparent and accountable. There is a bunch of information out there already, and to say that there is not, that there is a lack of detail, is simply just misleading the Australian people. And to the point about, we've had an Indigenous Affairs Minister in the past. In fact, the first Aboriginal person to be Indigenous Australians Minister was a former Liberal Minister, of course, Ken Wyatt. He appeared before the Joint Select Committee on the referendum, and he talked about the fact that even in his time in the Cabinet, he in fact listed a bunch of legislation that had come through the Parliament. He then listed the number of organisations that had been engaged on those pieces of legislation. And even though those pieces of legislation would have a direct impact on the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, there was zero Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations engaged on them. So to say that Aboriginal people already have a voice and opportunity to have a say in our Parliament is simply incorrect. And the proposal from the No campaign is to keep doing the same thing and expecting different results. Now, I feel like there's a definition for that comes to mind. And surely that's just unthinkable for everybody to think that we will keep doing the same thing and get different results. Aboriginal people have come to parliamentarians, they've come to the Australian people and asked us to do something different. They have said to us, we have the solutions, to the challenges that our communities face. We need a parliament that listens. We need a voice. Aboriginal people would not be asking for a voice enshrined in our constitution if they already felt heard. That is the very premise of the ask. The torment of our powerlessness, as quoted in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, is so clearly spelled out in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. It is a very clear invitation for each and every Australian to see what our communities are experiencing and to be a part of the solution too. Each and every Australian, then this is not always true, but each and every Australian in this referendum can do something that will close the gap for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and that is with 3 simple letters: YES.
I'm keen
Every Australian has the opportunity to do something.
So sorry to cut you off there, Jana Stewart. My apologies. I'm keen to get a sense from both of you what you think about what happens next week. So we get a result, a yes result or a no result, regardless of what happens there. What's the process from here in terms of looking at how this campaign has played out? It has been a pretty bitter at times debate, and if the broader community is feeling that, I can only imagine what the Indigenous community must be feeling about how it's all played out. Karen Little, what happens from here, not necessarily just next week, but in the weeks, months, years ahead, to try to deal with the reckoning that Australia has gone through as part of this process?
Well, look, I'd like to address one thing first, and that is the yes-no pamphlet that went to every Australian household is an important document to look at. You'll see that one side is full of vibe. They don't even have footnotes that actually allow you to go somewhere else to find the context in which the information is provided, including the first line being about, or the second line rather, being about 80% of Indigenous Australians agree, and I think that's been found by the latest poll to be incorrect. And on the no side, there is a bunch of information, plus there are references to where you can go and find more information and where those came from. So, you know, for me, all of those issues are valid on the no side. They've been shown to have context. But what I want to say about your question about going forward, it's not like this will be fixed tomorrow. There is a whole process, if yes is successful, that follows. We've heard even this week the Prime Minister say this has nothing to do with treaty, and yet we've heard over and over again the words treaty enmeshed with the actual proposition of voice. So we've heard that the priorities will be education, employment, housing, etc. But nobody can tell the voice what to look at or when, because there's simply not enough detail. That what's happening here is the Prime Minister and people advocating for yes are not listening. People want detail. They don't want a set of principles. There's actually a referendum working group that's been set up. It's been in place for quite a while. That's funded by the Commonwealth. How come we don't have more of the detail right now? How come people aren't going to the ballot box, being really clear about the detail, about what they're actually signing up to? Because whatever they sign up to, if it's a yes, is forever. Things won't change for me. I'll still be asking the Labor Party, I'll still be asking the Greens, and I'll still be asking Senator Pocock, let's do an inquiry into these organisations. Let's find out what's working. Let's find out what's not, and stop doing what is not working. Let's actually do this moving forward, because we're brave enough to actually do it, rather than being worried about being called racist, worried about being called idiots. These are not the ways these discussions should have been conducted. This is about finding solutions, and certainly whatever the result, I'm committed to continuing to go down that path of demanding accountability and answers regardless of Saturday's result.
Very briefly, Jana Stewart, because we are out of time, I want to ask you the same question. Where do we go to from here when it comes to that dealing with everything that's been dredged up over the last couple of weeks or so? In 30 seconds, sorry to put a time limit on you like that.
Well, a couple of things. It's the parliamentarian's job to come up with the details. It's actually Senator Little and I's job to fill in the details post-referendum. So that's one thing. The second thing is that, you know, we come together, we figure out where to next. There isn't a First Nations person that I speak to that hasn't felt the weight of this referendum. We hope we wake up with the resounding yes on October 15, and then the real work begins. Then we start a conversation with every Australian about what the voice should look like. And I think that is an incredibly aspirational and hopeful thing to look forward to on October 15.
I can see Karen Little shaking her head there, but we do need to let you both go today. Karen Little, Jana Stewart, thank you both for joining us on Afternoon Briefing.
Thanks so much.